It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Rami. I'm here with Tudor, the other founding partner of KANVA, firm in Montreal. The point is to share with you the story of Imago, which is actually an urban insertion project that attempted to mitigate the negative impacts of construction infrastructure sites in Montreal. KANVA, founded about 15 years ago, is a practice that merges art and architecture, building ephemeral and permanent buildings, trying to reveal stories, narratives, using certain innovative technologies. The presentation today is based in three parts. The first one is to sort of reveal or talk a bit about the challenges of urban infrastructure systems. And then we jump into a case study in Montreal, SAINTE-CATHERINE Street, of how we try to address it differently. And finally, it's in sort of third part, an open-ended question on these experimental projects. How do they remain pertinent in urban ecosystem? So if we start with the first part, which is basically challenges in urban infrastructure systems, there is a very delicate balance right now and a challenge in how the growth within our cities is so evolving so rapidly, and how our infrastructures are trying to cope with this and trying to maintain that certain balance. What happens is that we actually have below ground a network which is often outdated with deferred maintenance and past its lifespan. And what happens is that we need to replace them. Common to many cities, what happens when we replace them is that we end up with a major struggle, humongous construction sites in the middle of the city that last for a long time. These result in a variety of negative impacts, from interruption of services. We often have accessibility and circulation as a problem, and all sorts of disturbance in terms of noise, smell, sound, etc. And from this stems economic, social, and political problems. There's businesses that starts closing. In Montreal, we had several important streets that lost almost 30% of its commercial spaces. And it starts having a sort of protest, a form of frustration from the public, which obviously lands into the offices of politics and city deciders. And so there's a decision to be done, which is often a challenge because political mandates are shorter in time than the duration of construction sites in the street. But instead of just depending on tax breaks, financial compensations, signage, and so forth, there's perhaps a different way of addressing construction sites. And so this brings us to the second part, which is a case study in Montreal in SAINTE-CATHERINE Street. SAINTE-CATHERINE Street is perhaps the most important commercial artery in Canada. It's a hub both for business, tourism, schools, universities, and etc. And it has a very historical character. But below SAINTE-CATHERINE Street, we have major problems, and it's running out of time to be able to fix up its underground. As a matter of fact, there's so many conduits leaking within the city that right now we're seeing actually a great waste of resources and natural energy. And so to address this, the metropolis decided that for 8 years and over 19 blocks, it was going to open up the street and refit. And of course, this brought great fear of how do we address, how do we change, what do we do to prevent a catastrophe on this main artery. And so the city came up with this competition called VIVRE le Chantier SAINTE-CATHI, which is to live the SAINTE-CATHERINE Street. There's 6 objectives, but basically what they're trying to do is how can you mitigate the impacts, how can you celebrate the new street, and can you perhaps find ways of securing economic stability. This is the first drawing we drew during the competition phase. And what we're trying to do in the street section is to sort of link the above ground and the below ground, to sort of show that our daily lives are directly linked to what's happening below ground, this interconnectivity between both. For our cities are living entities, and they continuously change and evolve depending on different scales of time. But this is not only true for above ground, it's also true for underground. It's a whole living system that she allows for us to live above ground. And so when we came and looked at this competition, our architectural intention was to build and propose something that would be dynamic, that would be accompanying the transformation of the street and sort of be as much alive with the city as its proposal could attend. And so we turned to nature and started studying different cycles, all the way from embryonic states to final stages. And the word Imago actually is the last stage of a butterfly cycle. And so these biomorphic, inflatable, pneumatic architecture, these structures accompany They go along the street and shelter and protect the pedestrians. They become a way of articulating the transformation of the city and celebrating its transformation. When you look at the wing, it's very delicate membranes, and basically through their configuration, they have an efficient structural system. And so we tried at the same time to inspire ourselves from this to design the structural system that could be efficient and deploy itself throughout the site. Imago is basically composed of three parts. At the base, you have a concrete jersey, very similar to what's kept to maintain vehicular control. Above, you have a high-strength polycomposite textile that's inflated. And at the base, between the two, is a plate. And this plate holds all sorts of lighting fixtures, but it also holds the air supplies for the inflatable structures and control systems to have active management of the air pressure and of the lighting performance. The first 3 meters are the heavier gauge, as they're interacting directly with the public and need to be overly protected. And as we go up, there's openings. And these openings actually are trying to decrease the resistance to rain, wind, and snow loads. And at the top, at the crest of the wall, we have a hinge that sort of creates a pinch. And what this pinch does is that it allows for the Imago's span to vary. And we go from a wide span of almost 12.5 meters, the height is about approximately 3 floors, to a narrow span, which is 9.5 meters. So not only is it easy to start moving along the site, but it could change its configuration to start adapting to the width. And at the same time, being based and composed mainly of air, it's able to expand and all of a sudden occupy the site to the scale of the street. This is a simple or typical sequence that would happen on a street as construction is evolving. This is Sainte-Catherine Street. There's piles that come and be planted. And immediately in the wide span configuration, Imago comes on the edge of the sidewalks. This allows for excavation to happen below while shielding the public that's walking along the sidewalks. After excavation, we replace the infrastructure systems and we start backfilling and follow with the preliminary paving. And this allows now to transfer and change the span. We drop to a narrow span, allowing now the work to be occupied on the sidewalk, and the public starts circling in the center of the street. Excavation on the sides, replacements as necessary, followed by the backfill, and finally we get to this preliminary paving. We can then fully remove the inflatable structure, go for the full removal of the piles, pave, and we've sort of completed the cycle. And so what happens is that at times, Imago is a shelter, it's a gathering space. It's sort of available to the public as a new way of inhabiting the city. And at times it shelters a construction site, which impose all sorts of strict studies in terms of the type of machinery, the ventilation, the lighting, and so forth, to be able to start and create a division, both visual and psychological. The module is quite simple, actually. If you look at it in plan, it's an asymmetrical shape, and a typical assembly puts 2 modules together. And what this allows us to do is to be able to have different configurations and adapt ourselves to street and site conditions. So there's the hinge at the top, there's the way we're being deployed quickly, there's the lightness of it, and there's the way we can move around. And so what happens is that Imago also offers the opportunity of being an orientation tool. On the left, you see that as an intersection, and it's now acting as a buffer between the street and the construction work, and allowing for a clear defining of the perimeter. And on the right, which is interesting, is that as the street's being transformed, so are the public places. And so as we remove these public spaces, which are important to the community, to the city, and so forth, then we must offer a new public space to citizens. And so Imago becomes a shelter, a place where different programming can occur and offers this public space to the citizens. And with the integration of different lighting at its base and the great potentials of projection, we realize that all of a sudden it becomes an event. And so that sort of summarizes the second part, the case study, after having seen the infrastructures. And now we sort of wonder what is the second life within this urban ecosystem of these installations. I believe infrastructures will just continue to grow and grow. Construction sites will always occupy our streets in the city. And so the way Imago addressed it was to simply establish a dialogue and decide to accompany the construction site and sort of be part of this transformation. Inspired by nature, what it simply did is place itself between the city and construction. And as this construction site comes to an end, others will occur, and other design solutions will come and inhabitate the city. And perhaps it's an opportunity for Imago, this nomadic architecture, to keep its journey, to keep going along the street, along the city, whether in public markets, being present at different events, or being along different bike paths. The point is that by maintaining it active within the city, what we're trying to do is to remind people of our connection to the below ground and having the opportunity of this nomadic simple gesture to somewhat be an elegant icon within the city itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating project. Christine, kick us off.
Being an inhabitant of London that seems to be permanently having its roads dug up, I'm very sympathetic to this project. I'm assuming that St. Catherine's Street is a pedestrian precinct. It isn't. Okay. I wasn't then quite clear about how you deal with traffic.
The traffic, actually, the city is removing traffic from the street. It's using all the side streets, but what is happening, the only thing we need to respect, well, actually there's different, setting up the installation actually is dependent on what's happening with the construction road. The first reflex of the city was to say we're going to get everybody off the street, block per block, go around, and make sure that we can actually follow through the vehicular. Emergency vehicles must continue, okay? But then as people are starting to go, they're trying to establish, can we work 24 hours around and start splitting the street in half and so forth. And so since there we're not sure, that's where the discussions for the hinge arrived. And to try and see, well, since you're not going to be able to decide and you have to react to existing conditions, then we need to be able to adapt to you.
Okay, could I ask another question? Environmental protection, how much environmental protection does it give you, particularly in the winter?
It will not cover from the snow.
It won't?
No, I think that what we learned quickly when designing it with the structural engineers Blackwell is that the more we try and make this a closed, fully shielded entity, the more it will fly away. And we can tie it to 6-7 concrete jerseys, it'll just leave with the whole thing. So the point is actually at the bottom, where there is the potential of actually closing up the spaces between the membranes, those are not permanent. There's always a weaker point. We create a hinge that's weaker, and if wind will arrive, it would just immediately open up. Right? It's actually controlled through a phone. And what happens is that as we gradually reach certain wind pressures, because of climatic conditions having increased stress in terms of the climate, then we're advised, and there's different tools that can be used to resist. The worst reflex would be to overinflate. The more we're hard, the more we'll resist, the more we'll fly away. And if you reach a certain point which is past critical, the structure is immediately deflated.
Okay, thank you.
Karen?
Yeah, I really like it. I think all the cities in the world are suffering with the same problems. We definitely have it in our cities. Infrastructure is collapsing. Is there the political will to do it? And the money?
It's a big question. We could perhaps have a coffee afterwards.
Okay.
I'll tell you what. It went, not only did we win and we were able to produce all the bid documents, it went for tender. Okay. And there was a selected contractor with an expertise in pneumatic architecture. And as signing occurred last fall, we changed mayor. And so until then, it's been put on the side, and they've decided to change the plans of the new street. So it's actually not just putting this aside. What they want to design on the street is now being revised. I think they want it more pedestrian, more bike paths, and so forth. And I think when it comes back up, then we'll have that discussion with the city. How do we go forward? And discussions have also occurred of, can it be placed before construction? Can it be placed somewhere else? One of the ideas, there are 19 boroughs in Montreal. Is it possible to place it on the street, have part of the work began? When the construction is intense, does it leave the site and remind the 19 boroughs of its main street and come back?
I just want to ask a technical question. So
Yes.
it's inflatable?
Yes.
So you can deflate it and package it and move it?
Yes. Actually, the criteria we had from the fire department was to inflate or deflate within 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Paul?
It reminds me of two great figures of the past, Cedric Price and Corbusier, both who were preoccupied with the under the
underground.
street. And Alice Hillman, a friend of Cedric's, wrote a book, London Under London, and you're quite right, it's complex down there, but it's messy, and we always dig holes, and then we fill them up again, and then we dig them again. And this doesn't solve that problem. We've still got to dig the holes and get down there and get messy and fill it up again. So it's really about easing the transition over the repair process. A generation are going to be taxed in terms of their time and inconvenience and money to provide better for the future, and this is going to kind of ease that process. And so I'm looking at it as a device in that sense, beautiful device to ease that process. And it begs a couple of questions to me. I mean, snow and rain. There's also noise is another terrible problem with the digging and the banging and all the rest of it. So noise isn't going to be helped here at all. Perhaps a comment on the extent of the suffering reduction, and why can't we look at noise as well? I suppose it's just too difficult.
I think what we tried to do on the first 3 meters is try and have some form of a greater barrier. Are we going to solve noise? No. And I think that noise is a big problem on construction sites in the city, as you're hearing the hammering, especially when they start digging up and so forth. Attenuating sound, however, yes, it would be an interesting thing to study all on its own. Would be an interesting challenge to take on, yes.
Cedric did a project exactly on that called McCappy.
McCappy.
Yeah, and he looked at noise as well. But it's very interesting. I'm fascinated by what you do and the way an architect's mind can work when he gets stuck into a problem like this.
Yes, it's a bit...
No, I think it's a fascinating project, and I know Montreal because I have relatives there. The other, not to get too prosaic about it, but Paul's mentioned noise, construction sites. They're also dirty, and this is a delightfully pristine white structure. I presume it's easy to clean. Because there's nothing more than a grubby, over time getting grubbier and grubbier.
Yes. It's funny you said it, because since we were allowed to put together the bid documents for the general contractors, both the ones moving Imago and the ones performing the construction work, when we had, I think this is blocking, but when we were asking at different stages, every time it'd be moved, it'd be cleaned. Yeah? So it is easily cleanable, because it is a target, we understand. It's been tested to be able to see how it can react to graffiti, to drawings, to any form of vandalism. The city required that we actually have different pieces tested, and we tried to rip them up and break them and tear them and do all that to show that it can hold.
So if someone comes at it with a knife just because they get drunk one evening, it'll survive?
Technically, the first 3 meters will survive a drunken or non-drunken person that wishes to perform a violent activity on the object. And believe it or not, the greatest fear that the security department had was, what if somebody on the 3rd floor of a building decides to jump onto it and see if it bounces?
Yeah.
And so they sort of established a distance, a minimum distance from facades. It's quite interesting, the world of vandalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes you think about things in a completely different way.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable that we actually cohabitate.
But
That's another thing.
okay. Well, thank you. A delightful project, and just stay there, and I'll.
Thank you
give a
very
trophy.
much.
Thank you.